There's a kind of solitude that doesn't begin with rejection, but with recognition. A moment early in life when the INFJ or INTJ mind first realizes that most conversations move too quickly, most emotions unfold too loudly, and most people simply do not live in the same interior depth they do. What others call connection often feels like erosion, a gradual softening of clarity, a quiet pressure to translate thoughts that were never meant to be spoken in pieces. And so, over time, a choice is made, not loudly and not all at once, but in subtle, internal gestures. You step back. You stop offering the whole of yourself. You begin to shape a life around silence, not because you hate others, but because you've learned that being misunderstood costs more than being alone. But the truth is, even chosen solitude comes with a price. You wake one day and realize that the stillness, once sacred, has turned to ache, that the peace you crafted so carefully now rings with something hollow. You still need space, yes. You still prefer clarity over chaos. But something in you has started to ask, did I really choose this life of distance? Or did I simply stop believing I could ever be fully seen and still stay whole? It rarely begins with a collapse. For most INFJs and INTJs, the decision to pull away from others isn't born from catastrophe, but from a quiet string of subtle moments. Moments that, on the surface, don't seem like enough to change anything. You say something sincere and someone brushes it off with a joke. You share a complex idea and you're met with blank eyes or a shift in topic. You offer part of your truth and it lands in the wrong hands. You don't storm out, you don't explode. You simply begin the slow retreat that no one sees happening, except you. And what you're retreating from isn't cruelty, it's misalignment. It's the ache of presence without resonance. INFJs and INTJs don't need crowds or attention. They need psychological oxygen. And when a room runs out of that, when it becomes clear that your depth is unwanted or unreadable, you begin to feel not just out of place, but untranslatable. INFJs experience this through the tension between Ni's internal clarity and Faye's external accommodation, constantly reading a room that cannot read them back. For INTJs, Ni sees the pattern breakdown, while Tay recognizes the inefficiency of adapting. Both quietly conclude, if others can't meet you where you are, it's better not to show up at all. And so the first withdrawal happens, not out of pride or rejection, but out of preservation. You pull away to conserve something fragile, your inner clarity, your emotional coherence, your truth. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But for many INFJs and INTJs, the terror isn't in self-acceptance. It's in realizing how rarely that self is recognized by others. When your insights are met with confusion, when your calm is mistaken for coldness, when your compassion is interpreted as calculation, you start to ask, what's the point of being fully present if presence means distortion? So you adapt, not visibly, but internally. You begin scanning conversations before they start. You read people before they know they're being read. You start editing yourself in real time, cutting the edges off your truth, softening your perception, staying just enough on the surface to avoid being alien. And over time, a habit forms. You stop speaking unless it's necessary. You stop reaching unless you already know the answer. You stop showing up unless the space feels earned. But let me ask you this. When you began pulling away, did you even realize it was a form of grief? Not for what happened, but for what could never happen. For the depth that went unfelt. For the conversations that never took root. For the parts of you that still remain untouched, not by cruelty, but by absence. This is where the INFJ and INTJ path often diverges from the rest. Where others react to noise, you react to lack. Not lack of people, but lack of precision, of alignment, of reciprocity in presence. And so your mind, governed by introverted intuition, begins building an inner world far more coherent than the one around you. A sanctuary of thought. A space where nothing has to be diluted to be safe. But the danger of that sanctuary is how easy it becomes to mistake it for enough, to confuse emotional autonomy with emotional closure. To believe that because you can survive alone, you were never meant to belong. And in that belief, so subtle, so noble, you begin to abandon the very part of you that once hoped someone might meet you without translation. If you've ever found yourself fading from the room without meaning to, stay with me. You're not the only one who disappears quietly. At first, solitude feels like sanctuary. You don't name it that way. You just start choosing it more often. You linger in your own thoughts a little longer. You opt out of the conversations that feel like performance. You say less, not because you have less to say, but because you've started measuring how often what you say lands in the wrong way. And slowly, without design, solitude becomes your default. It's clean, quiet, yours. But what starts as recovery can become a blueprint, and eventually it becomes architecture. Every time you feel too seen and too misunderstood in the same moment, another brick is added. Every time you offer something sincere and it's taken the wrong way, the doorway narrows. Until one day, you realize the walls were never built in anger, they were built in grief. As Jung wrote, loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important. And when you live in a world that rarely speaks your internal language, the most fluent move becomes silence. You speak less, you reveal less, you adjust, not to deceive, but to preserve. If you're an INFJ, you likely felt this as emotional dissonance. You show up warm, attentive, receptive, and yet something in you knows you're being read through the wrong lens. You become so good at helping others feel understood that you lose track of how rarely you feel that in return. And so you pull back, not obviously, but carefully, not out of resentment, but fatigue. If you're an INTJ, the withdrawal may feel more cerebral. You register the inefficiencies of emotional nuance. You get tired of clarifying that your bluntness is not a lack of care. You stop letting people in, not because you fear them, but because their inability to understand your internal logic makes the exchange feel unbalanced. At this point, Nai takes full control, seeking insight, not contact. Fei or Te no longer reach outward, but recede. INFJs become emotionally diplomatic even with themselves, while INTJs double down on cognitive efficiency. And underneath, Tai or Phi quietly filter experience into private conclusions. Every function learns to operate without relational feedback. And so, you optimize for solitude, structure without friction. But here's the part you rarely admit. Do you genuinely prefer being alone? Or have you just trained yourself to believe it's safer? When you say, I don't need anyone, is that sovereignty or defense? When you say, I'd rather be alone than misunderstood, are you choosing solitude or avoiding rupture? This is the turning point. Not a collapse, but a quiet moment of reckoning. You look at the walls you've built and realize they are beautiful, thoughtfully constructed, designed with care. But they are walls all the same. And while they've kept you from unnecessary harm, they may also be keeping you from the kind of intimacy you forgot how to want. If this struck a chord, if you saw yourself here, like the video and subscribe. We're going somewhere even deeper next. There comes a moment, quiet, often unspoken, when the solitude you once craved starts to feel heavy. Not wrong, not dramatic, just heavier than it used to. The space that used to feel sacred now feels still, not in the peaceful sense, but in the way air goes still before a storm. You look around and realize that, for all the clarity and calm your retreat has offered you, something essential has gone missing. Not noise, not company, but something else, something that aches in a way even your introspective mind struggles to name. It's not that you want crowds, it's not even that you want to be known by many. What you want, what you may have always wanted, is to be known well, to be seen in a way that doesn't ask you to narrate your value or explain your wiring. But that kind of recognition is rare, and after years of not finding it, you told yourself you didn't need it. That independence was enough. That solitude was not just safer, but superior. But is it? You've sharpened your inner world to perfection. You know your patterns, your triggers, your strengths, your needs. But who sees that work but you? Who reflects it back to you with warmth, with steadiness, with something resembling love? Let me ask you, when was the last time someone really saw you and you let them? Not in pieces, not through performance, but fully. When was the last time you let yourself need that? There's a hunger that high-functioning loners rarely admit. It's not physical, it's not even emotional in the conventional sense. It's existential. The hunger to belong, not in the crowd, but in someone's understanding. The hunger to be held, not in arms, but in someone else's perception. To exist in someone's mind in a way that feels accurate, whole, undistorted. And that hunger, when unfed for too long, starts turning inward. What once felt like solitude begins to feel like erasure. You start wondering if you're disappearing, not because you're broken, but because you've quietly stopped allowing the world to reflect you. Your self-awareness deepens, yes, but so does your sense of isolation. Fae and Phi, though introverted, aren't meant to operate in echo chambers. When they go too long without authentic connection, INFJs lose their emotional fluidity and become brittle. INTJs lose the warmth of conviction and retreat into sterile logic. Nye may keep spinning, but without resonance, even vision starts to lose its color. Because there's no longer anyone present to echo back what you've worked so hard to name. As Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "I am too alone in the world, and yet not alone enough." This is the paradox. You've chosen distance as a way to preserve yourself, but now the distance begins to consume what it once protected. You're not lonely because you don't enjoy your own company. You're lonely because no one else has been allowed in, and the parts of you that long for resonance are starting to wither, not out of weakness, but from neglect. This is not collapse in the cinematic sense. There is no dramatic undoing here, just a soft quieting, a silence that begins to feel less like peace and more like forgetting. Not forgetting others, but forgetting how it once felt to be mirrored, to be invited, to be understood without having to teach someone how. And maybe, just maybe, you're starting to wonder whether solitude was ever supposed to be the final destination, or whether it was meant to be a resting place you mistook for home. If you've ever wondered whether you built a sanctuary or just found a more elegant way to disappear, stay with me. You feel the pull sometimes, that quiet longing to be part of something again. Not the crowd, not the noise, but something human, something warm. A conversation that doesn't require translation. A presence that doesn't demand explanation. The ache is subtle, but persistent, like muscle memory from a life you once lived before the walls were built. But every time you think of reaching out, a quiet voice surfaces. Don't bother. It's not cynicism. It's not superiority. It's memory. You remember the energy it takes to explain yourself, the misunderstandings you didn't correct, the closeness that turned cold without warning. You remember how much you gave, how little returned, and how much of yourself you lost in the exchange. And so you hesitate, not because you're detached, but because you're tired. So what do you do when the part of you that craves connection is the same part that's learned to fear it? For INFJs, the conflict is emotional. You want resonance so badly that even the hint of emotional mismatch feels dangerous. You've been the emotional safe haven for so many people that the idea of needing someone else, truly needing them, feels almost shameful. So you offer empathy, insight, support, and then quietly retreat when no one notices your silence. For INTJs, the conflict is structural. You want loyalty, clarity, reciprocity. You're not afraid of intensity. You're afraid of interference. You've built a life that protects your time, your vision, your peace. But connection is unpredictable. People are unpredictable, and needing someone introduces a variable you can't control. So instead of risking chaos, you optimize for distance. INFJs pull back when Faye begins to feel like emotional debt, when every conversation asks for more than it gives. INTJs pull back when Phi feels its core values misread or ignored. The outer functions, Fei and Te, disengage quietly, but it's the inner ones, Nai and Phi Tai, that retreat deeper, reinforcing the belief that distance is smarter than hope. But here's the question, Neither type often asks aloud, is the solitude still protecting you, or is it punishing you? You tell yourself you're just particular, that you have high standards, that the world is noisy and shallow, and you're better off outside it. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes that's fear dressed up as discernment. As Nietzsche wrote, invisible threads are the strongest ties. And perhaps, somewhere along the line, you convinced yourself that connection should be effortless, unspoken, obvious, and if it isn't, it must not be meant for you. But what if that belief has become a prison? What if the connections you crave require something you haven't offered in a long time? Not perfection, but permission. Because reaching out doesn't mean collapsing. It doesn't mean losing your edge. It means letting someone see the parts you haven't rehearsed, the contradictions, the questions, the quiet hunger that still lives under your structure. So the next time you feel the pull to say something, to invite someone in, to answer honestly when someone asks how you're doing, what will you do? Will you wait for the perfect moment, the perfect person? Or will you let your humanity interrupt your pattern even just a little? If this landed somewhere real, drop a comment. You don't need to explain everything, just say you're here. Sometimes that's enough. It's not that you don't want connection, it's that you no longer trust yourself to survive it. After years of adaptation, misinterpretation, and retreat, the idea of letting someone in feels less like intimacy and more like risk. Not because others are unsafe, but because the version of you they'd meet might no longer feel solid enough to hold. When you've spent so long controlling your own psychological environment, the presence of another person feels like an unpredictable variable, one that could either nourish you or unravel everything you've built. This is the quiet dilemma for both INFJs and INTJs, the desire for closeness wrapped in a deep fear of collapse. You want to be known, but you've learned how much of yourself the world edits out. You want to be witnessed, but you're not sure where the performance ends and your real self begins. For the INFJ, this tension shows up in the Feni loop, endlessly anticipating others' needs while losing contact with your own. For the INTJ, Phi holds conviction tightly, but without relational mirroring. It becomes more rigid than real. What looks like control on the outside is often a stack that's gone too long without trust. And perhaps the hardest part, you've been gone so long from relational spaces that you've forgotten how to show up without scanning, without adjusting, without armoring. Let me ask you, what would it take for you to let someone in without shaping yourself for them? Could you allow yourself to be seen as is, in your silence and sharpness, your tenderness and your edge, without apologizing for the contradictions? For INFJs, the fear is often emotional fusion. That opening up will mean being consumed by someone else's needs, losing the integrity of your internal world to the tide of their expectations. For INTJs, the fear is structural collapse, that allowing someone close will compromise your clarity, blur your vision, invite inefficiency into a system you've carefully calibrated to minimize unnecessary disruption. And yet, both fears stem from the same place, a belief that connection requires a kind of self-abandonment, that to be close is to be distorted. But that belief is not a truth. It's a trauma. As Jeanette Winterson wrote, to trust another with your whole self is the most frightening act of faith there is. And for types like INFJ and INTJ, who build strength from introspection and mastery, vulnerability is not a natural language. It is one learned slowly, with care, and often in the aftermath of years spent in exile. Letting others in doesn't mean losing yourself. It means learning to stay present, fully present, even when resonance feels imperfect. It means remembering that not every misstep is a betrayal, that not every silence means rejection, and that the self you've protected for so long may be strong enough now to stand in the presence of another without disappearing. So when the next moment of closeness presents itself, however small, however tentative, will you shut the door automatically, or will you pause long enough to see who's knocking? You don't need to swing the door wide, just leave the lock undone. If you're still trying to figure out how to stay open without breaking, stay with me. The return isn't about becoming new. It's about remembering what solitude never took away. Solitude was never your flaw. In the beginning, it was your clarity, your sanctuary, the only place where you could think without distortion, feel without translation, exist without interruption. It gave you structure. It gave you distance. It gave you peace. But even peace, if held too long, becomes silence. And even silence, when left unshared, becomes erasure. You didn't retreat because you lacked strength. INFJs and INTJs both rely on Ni to make meaning in isolation. But when Fei or Te fall silent, and Phi or Tai become the only judges left in the system, the perspective narrows. Ni loops, unchallenged. The internal structure remains intact, but begins to feel like the only real thing, even as life outside becomes increasingly unreal. You retreated because your depth needed room to breathe, and the world as it was didn't offer it. So you built a space for yourself, and for a while, that space became everything. But perhaps now, the question isn't why you chose it. The question is whether you still need to. Is your isolation still protecting you? Or has it become the very thing you now need protection from? The INFJ and INTJ mind has a gift for endurance. You can outlast most environments. You can hold your own company for weeks, even years. But endurance is not belonging. And there comes a point when even the strongest self-sufficiency begins to starve. Not for attention, not even for affirmation, but for something truer, resonance, shared understanding. Not having to explain why your silence is not withdrawal, why your observations run so deep, why your presence is often quiet, but never empty. So let me ask you, if someone offered you that kind of recognition, slow, spacious, real, would you even recognize it? Would you let yourself step toward it? Or have you rehearsed solitude for so long that intimacy now feels like unfamiliar choreography? There's nothing wrong with your independence. There's nothing wrong with your distance, but neither were meant to become permanent. And if you look closely, you'll see, even now, after all this time, there's a part of you that still longs to be known without performance. To belong, not because you've adapted, but because someone sees the structure and the softness and chooses to stay. As Jung wrote, "We are not what happened to us. We are what we choose to become." And if solitude helped you become whole, then perhaps connection is what will help you become real again. You chose to step away, and that choice saved something in you. But now you get to choose again, this time not out of fear, but out of readiness. If this gave language to something you've felt, share it with someone who's been walking alone a little too long. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. You don't have to do this alone. You didn't step away because you were broken, nor did you retreat out of pride. You stepped away because you saw more than others could hold, because your depth made most spaces feel shallow, and because solitude, at the time, felt like the only place where you could remain intact without dilution. You learned how to survive that way, elegantly, silently, carrying entire worlds inside you that no one asked to see. And now, standing at the edge of everything you built to stay whole, you might be wondering whether it's possible to return, not to the noise, not to the shallowness, but to something softer, more human, more alive. This isn't a grand transformation. It's not a performance of healing or a sudden leap toward intimacy. It's something quieter, a slow re-entry, a remembering. That connection does not have to cost you your clarity. That presence does not have to mean distortion. And that maybe, just maybe, someone is waiting, not for the mask, not for the silence, but for the version of you that never stopped hoping it might be safe to come back.